A God that is omniscient is incompatible with a God that gives us free will.
No, he isn't.
Yes, it is, if you claim that omniscience entails knowledge of future free actions. If you're an open theist like myself and you don't think omniscience entails this type of knowledge of future actions, then there isn't a problem, but I'll get to that in a second. So in this video, Mike tries to affirm the compatibility of divine foreknowledge about human free actions, and he does so with a thought experiment that I myself used to give, but I've come to see that this thought experiment is flawed, so I'm going to critique Mike's argument.
Time.
So the problem with his reasoning is he is assuming foreknowledge causally determines us, and that's not how foreknowledge works.
So this is the first issue. Even if you think that divine foreknowledge doesn't causally determine our actions, it can still be the case that divine foreknowledge and free actions are incompatible. Or to put it different, God foreknowing our actions can entail true propositions that are inconsistent with the action being free, even if the knowledge isn't the direct cause of our actions. To say that God knows something is to say that it is true. That's an implication. And so many proponents of open theism would say that there is a contradiction between saying that there are future truths about my actions and also maintaining that these future actions are free. Let me explain why. Suppose you perform some action like raising your right hand. For that action to be free, it needs to be the case that you were free to do otherwise at that time. Or to put it another way, before you raised your hand, there were multiple ways that things could have gone. You could have raised your right hand, you could have raised your left hand, you could have kicked the wall, you could have picked your nose, so on and so forth. Before you made the choice to raise your right hand, there was a contingency that had not yet been resolved. However, when you freely make the choice to raise your right hand, you lock in your choice. Now let's ask the question, why is it the case that this contingency was actualized but not these others? Why is the statement, James raised his right hand, true instead of false? If we want to affirm libertarian free will, then the answer to this question needs to be the fact that James made this type of choice, right? And I need to be the explanation. Me making that choice needs to be the explanation for why that statement is true. Put simply, when James makes the choice at time t1, me making that choice is what resolves the contingency. Or put another way, James's choice is what grounds the truth of this proposition. But now we can start to see the issue. Let's go back to, let's say, t0. If my act of choosing at T1 is what resolves the contingency and grounds the truth of this proposition, then before I act, the contingency has not yet been resolved. The proposition, James raises his right hand at T1, that isn't yet true because the thing that grounds the truth of that proposition has not yet occurred. This is why open theists usually maintain that propositions such as James will do X are either all false or neither true nor false. So the issue here isn't about God and his foreknowledge. The issue is about how propositions about future actions can be true when the very thing which resolves the contingency has not yet happened. Saying God foreknows an act, again, entails that these types of future propositions are true, but the ability for them to be true is what is at issue here for many open theists.
Let's start with a simple analogy. Let's say I have a time machine, and I go forward to tomorrow, and I observe everything you do tomorrow.
Okay, so this is a pretty standard thought experiment when trying to argue Mike's position, but we need to point out some issues with it. The thought experiment of you traveling into the future or the past assumes a static or eternalist model of time, which affirms that the future and past, they already exist and they share equal ontological status with the present. First, there's no reason to think that this model of time is true, and there are really serious theological reasons for thinking that it's false. I won't go into depth into those issues here. I will simply point people towards the work of Ryan Mullins and his recent work on that for the details, but I will focus on one specific issue with this model of time, which is that, ironically, this model of time is not compatible with free will. So Mike's argument for how free will and divine foreknowledge can be compatible actually utilizes a conception of time which can't allow for free will. And to understand why this model of time can't allow for free will, consider this quote by Christian philosopher William Hasker. If the future already exists and all its concrete particularity, then where are the alternative possibilities that, as Roger agrees, are needed for free will? How is it possible for the agent to act any differently than in the already existing future she does in fact act? Ryan Mullins cites this quote from Hasker in his work and adds, "It is always eternally the case that S's choosing B at T2 is part of the four-dimensional continuum. This is just as much so before the choice is made as after it has been been made. There is no time whatever at which an actual alternative is possible. So already this argument has some serious problems, but I think it actually gets worse.
Then I get in the time machine and I come back to this very moment. Now I have foreknowledge of everything you're going to do tomorrow. Does my foreknowledge make you do those things?
So it isn't actually the case that you have foreknowledge of the acts, and to say that you do is actually, I think, going to lead to a logical contradiction. Let's start this off simple. Let's suppose that you see me pick my nose while walking down the street at 6:45 p.m. You now come to have the belief that James picked his nose at 6:45 p.m. while walking down the street. The reason that this belief is true, and the reason you can know it, is because the event which grounds its truth, which resolves the contingency between all the different possibilities that I had, that's already happened. The event which grounds the truth has happened. But now let's suppose you hop in your time machine and you go back beforehand by 10 minutes. Now you want to say that you know I will pick my nose, and you want to say that you know that will happen because you saw it happen. And when you say this, you're treating the event like it is something in your past, like it has already happened. Yet you want to say this is foreknowledge because it's about something in the future. So at that moment, you are simultaneously trying to say that this exact same event has already happened. You say this to ground your knowledge, while also saying it hasn't yet happened. And that's a bona fide logical contradiction. You can't say that the same event has already happened and yet has not yet happened. But this is where your thought experiment ends up leading you. So where does this lead us? Well, if you want to affirm libertarian free will, which I think we all should, and I suspect Mike agrees, you should probably affirm that God doesn't know all future actions, because there just aren't true propositions to be known about most of these type of statements, because the thing which grounds these truths have not happened yet. It's not that there are truths out there that God just isn't aware of them. So it's not like, he's not omniscient because there are truths he doesn't know. It's just that these aren't true statements to be known. And statements like Mike will raise his hand in 5 minutes, or James will pick his nose, these aren't true before we make these type of actions. You might say James might raise his hand, or James might pick his nose. Those are true statements. You might say there's an 80% probability of James raising his right hand. Like, we can make those type of statements, and those can be true or false. But to say James will do this is, I think that's a difficult position to hold. And as Christians, this fits well with what we see in the Bible. The Bible is filled with scriptures that indicate God didn't know what was going to happen before it happened. We see God getting surprised by things. So for instance, in Jeremiah 3:6-7, the Lord said to me in the days of King Josiah, have you seen what she did, that faithless one, Israel, how she went up on every high hill and under every green tree, and there played the whore? And I thought, after she has done all this, she will return to me. But she did not return, and her treacherous sister saw it. So in here, God is saying, Israel's doing all this, but when she's done, she's going to come back, and then, she doesn't come back. So God is encountering something that was unexpected. Deuteronomy 8:2 says, and you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. Now, in this verse, we're explicitly told that God tested them to know what was in their heart, whether they would keep his commandments or not. Mike has said things to me in the past that indicate he might try and get around this verse by saying that, well, the testing was really for the Israelites to know what was in their hearts. But that's not what the text says. The text makes it clear that God did this so that he would know what they would do. He would know what was in their heart. And we get these other verses that provide the same idea. So we see this also in 2 Chronicles 32:31. We're told regarding Hezekiah, God left him to himself in order to test him and to know all that was in his heart. This sure is odd that God is described as doing these things to know what people would do, or to know what's in their heart, if God eternally already knows all the choices these people are going to make. This seems, it doesn't really make sense. Then we get verses, of course, like Genesis 22:12, where Abraham is about to kill his son, and God stops him and says, now I know that you fear God. The clear implication is that before this, there was some uncertainty about what Abraham would do when put to the test, and this cleared matters up. So there's no reason to hand wave these away as metaphorical or mere anthropomorphizing or condescension or things like that. This is how God is presented to us in Scripture. It meshes well with the philosophical reasoning. So there's really no reason to fight the text on that.
The answer is no. What you do tomorrow determines what foreknowledge I have now.
But if what I do tomorrow, if that doesn't exist, if that hasn't happened, if that's not real, then it can't determine what God knows now. And so to engage in this type of thought or to engage in this type of position, I do think you're going to be forced into affirming some type of static eternalist model of time, in which case I think you have a whole nother host of issues about how this can possibly be compatible with free will, as I mentioned earlier, and I referenced the work of Ryan Mullins. If everybody has just been eternally, existing in this static block of time where, James at 6:45 p.m. is picking his nose and James at 8 o'clock is like taking a nap or something, if that's just eternally been the case, that those things have existing at that point, it's very difficult to see. And this has been true regardless of what happens in the past. Like there's no changing that goes on. There's just always this block. It's very difficult to see how there are any alternative possibilities. And as Ryan Mullins notes, we then have to ask questions such as, why does this block exist? What grounds this block's existence? And if you're a Christian and you want to say God, well then how is it at any time slice, how am I going to be able to change something that's present at some other time slice on this block, which God himself is grounding? Like this, I really think the ontology of time that Mike is bringing to the table here and is trying to take advantage of is going to bite him in the rear when it comes to wanting to affirm free will. And then also there's all other types of theological issues that come about, as I said, when affirming this. So for instance, if you think every moment of time has equal ontological status, past, present, future, then what you end up saying is evil is never defeated. So if you take the entire, kind of block of space-time, no matter what happens in the future, there will always be this chunk of time that is eternally present and never ceases to go away, because Mike's affirming this eternalist model of time, in which evil always exists. In God's creation, it has eternally existed. It will eternally exist going forward. Creation is always tainted. And the people who are in those chunks of that block who are suffering, they suffer there on that block eternally. Now, there may be some different slice of this block in which, some related James counterpart, experiences bliss. But as far as me, when I'm suffering in that moment in that moment in that block is eternal. And so I eternally suffer. And so you have trouble getting redemption. You have trouble getting free will. You have trouble getting the ultimate defeat of evil. I think Mike needs to take some time and really think about the philosophy of time that he's bringing to the table here.
That's how God's omniscience works. We are still in control of our actions, and our actions determine what foreknowledge God had.
So you just affirmed backwards causation, the idea that something I do now can cause something to be true in the past. And that's just, I've already pointed out some issues with Mike's ontology of time here, but backwards causation is usually recognized in philosophy as just being bonkers, I think for obvious reasons.
And so William Lane Craig has said that God's foreknowledge is like the infallible weather barometer. It always accurately predicts the weather, but it doesn't cause the weather. And likewise, our actions determine what God foreknew. It's not the other way around. God's foreknowledge is not determining our actions.
So I've actually responded to this weather barometer thought experiment in a previous post. If somebody else tried to use, William Lane Craig's argument. So rather than repeating myself, I'm just going to be the lazy theologian that I am, and I'm just going to snip my response on that here. So this analogy breaks down when one recognizes a pretty serious discontinuity in the analogy. The reading of the barometer are causally grounded by the existence of something in reality at the time of the reading. The reading of the weather barometer is never chronologically prior to the physical reality which grounds its readings. Additionally, if this barometer is 100% accurate and never fails, that means that at the time of the reading, there is something present in our physical reality which causally entails the occurrence of what it predicts. If there was nothing in our physical reality which causally entails the predicted event, then it would be possible for the barometer to be wrong, but you've already said it can't be. So with this aspect of the analogy in mind, if we applied this to God, that means that if God knows you're going to do something, that means there is something in reality which grounds that knowledge. But you've already said that the thing which grounds God's knowledge is your action. And 10,000 years ago, your action had not been made. Therefore, 10,000 years ago, God didn't know your action. If you like this video, remember to check out my YouTube, which is linked in my TikTok profile. I've been posting some longer form content there recently. Haven't been doing as much on TikTok, so check that out.